If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. The Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Today we have Sonia interviewing John about literary dependence and the synoptic problem. This is looking at the process by which the gospel authors went about writing the gospel books. Given that the gospel books are so similar, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it raises the questions such as, do they copy each other? Are the similarities due to divine inspiration from the Holy Spirit? What do the evangelical scholars say about this? Is there something wrong with their approach? John will be looking to answer these questions and more. We're continuing from the previous episode today. We hope you enjoy!
Next point that Ferguson makes, signposts about authorial speculation. The authors of Greco-Roman Bioi often had to speculate about, quote, the exact words spoken by individuals in famous speeches or the exact order in which things had taken place in past events. In order to provide elegant rhetorical prose, however, creative liberties had to be taken on the part of the author to retell these dialogues as they plausibly could have taken place. And when the authors of Greco-Roman Biois were speculating, they indicated that they were doing so. Now that one is very, very important, isn't it?
Well, you can't really compare because in the case of the gospel books, the writers were inspired by God, so they didn't have to rely on their memories for exact words and so on. Didn't have to take creative liberties.
Yes, they never had to speculate. But here's two things. Licona will tell you that the gospel writers are doing what the Greco-Roman writers did. They don't remember. They have to speculate. Licona says that he goes to his book and he's pointing to many examples of speculation. But Ferguson here tells us that when the Greco-Roman writers do that, they tell us that they're doing that. Is there any place in the gospel books where the writers are speculating and telling us they're speculating?
No.
Absolutely not. That is a knockout blow, isn't it? And the irony here, and this is quite a problem. The atheist is the one who's telling us that there's differences between the gospel books and the Greco-Roman Bior, because the Greco-Roman Bior included speculations and reconstructions.
Unbelievable.
He says that that's a difference, you see. The atheist is implying at least that there are no speculations or reconstructions in the gospel books, and our evangelical scholars are telling us, yes, there are. Wow. Ferguson has more. Independence versus interdependence. One thing that amazes me as a classicist is just how interdependent the Gospels are upon each other. Matthew borrows from much as 80% of Mark's material, and Luke borrows from 65% of the material of the earliest Gospel. Now, he's wrong on this, and we've covered that, but from his point of view, that's what he thinks, and even the evangelical scholars will give him aid and comfort on that. He says, the same is not true for ancient historical works. Consider just the four most extensive sources that we have for the life of the Emperor Tiberius: Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. All four authors obtain their material from a broad range of sources rather than simply copy from each other. They write in a far more diverse range of styles, and yet they independently corroborate each other's claims. And so, while Ferguson is wrong on this, what he's saying is something that the evangelical scholars agree with. They will tell you that, yes, Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. At the same time, they're telling these are Greco-Roman Bioi, and Ferguson's telling us that no, Greco-Roman biographers didn't do that.
So this is like answering a fool according to his folly, I suppose.
Well, it does put them into this catch-22. Because on the one hand, they'll say that, yes, they copied verbatim, large chunks of text, and yes, they're Greco-Roman BOI, whereas in fact, if they're Greco-Roman BOI, they shouldn't have copied large chunks of text. If they copy large chunks of text, they're not Greco-Roman BOI. So on their own assumptions, there's no internal consistency. Next point says miracles at the fringe versus the core of the narrative. That may be true, but I suppose that's because the subjects of Greco-Roman BOI
Couldn't do miracles.
Yeah, they didn't do miracles. So yeah, remember, they could make up miracles about them, but it's still a difference, isn't it?
Yes.
Next point he makes, he says, important characters and events do not disappear from the narrative. Ferguson cites the case of the Roman prefect Sejanus, who allegedly plotted against Tiberius, supposedly with many allies in the Roman Senate, and was executed in AD 31. Ferguson suggests that it would have been illogical if there was no aftermath or follow-up and the narrative merely moved on to another subject. Instead, both Tacitus, Book 6, and Dio, Book 58, spend a considerable amount of narrative space discussing the senators who were accused and condemned for being co-conspirators with Sejanus. He then cavils that, quote, in the Gospels, earth-shaking events take place that then receive no follow-up and strangely disappear once they have played their symbolic role in the narrative. These include the rising of the saints in Matthew 27, 52 to 53, about which Ferguson complains that there is no follow-up in the Gospels or Acts of how the city was affected by this, and the charge that the disciples stole the body of Jesus, Matthew 28, 11 to 15, about which Ferguson complains that there's no follow-up prosecution of the disciples for this charge, even when they are brought to court on other issues. Ferguson also complains that there is no mention of Joseph of Arimathea being questioned about the empty tomb, and that there's no mention of any investigation into the matter by Pontius Pilate, who, says Ferguson, is so worried that Jesus' tomb will be found empty, lest people believe a miracle had occurred, as if all of the saints' resurrections weren't convincing enough, that he has guards stationed at the tomb. Pilate has gone to great lengths to ensure that Jesus' body did not go missing.
Well, those seem like some pretty significant differences.
Yes. Now, of course, Ferguson is wrong on this last one. As you read through the accounts, you find that Pilate had no worry that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. He was just another criminal put to death by him. Probably an innocent guy from the point of view of Pilate, but who cares? He's put to death. He's going to stay dead. It was the Jewish authorities who came to him and said, oh, this guy said he's going to rise. We need to guard the tomb. And so Pilate said, okay, here you have a guard. Go do it. He was not really worried about the resurrection at all. So on that, Ferguson is incorrect, that particular example, but the point is still that in Greco-Roman BOI, they are following up these things. So we've seen this list then, the list of similarities and the list of differences. Which one do you think is more persuasive?
The differences.
Yeah, no question about it. The claim that the gospel books are Greco-Roman BOI simply do not stand up to the test. And that's if we have only this one point. There is a second point that also debunks that idea. And that's the testimony of what we call the early church fathers, that is, Christian leaders who lived shortly after the apostles and the 1st century, 2nd century, and so on. The significance of their testimony cannot be overstated, because these are people who were living in the time that Greco-Roman BOI were being written. They're the people who spoke these languages as living languages. And their testimony is generally not even looked at in this issue. However, there are scholars such as F. David Farnell who have done a great job in looking through their views of this matter. And he finds that the early church fathers are universally opposed to Greek literature in general, including the Greco-Roman BOI. They debunk them. They disparage them. This includes fathers like Clement of Alexandria in his book Miscellanies, Eusebius in preparation for the Gospel. They're denouncing both the style of these Greco-Roman writings and their content. They charge them with having fables in them, and plagiarisms. And isn't it interesting that these evangelical scholars who are pushing for the idea of Greco-Roman bioi and saying, therefore, we can see some fables in the gospel books, that's the very reason, or one of the reasons, that the early church fathers rejected these kind of writings, because they had fables in them and plagiarisms, and the gospel books don't. They insisted that the gospel books were actually stylistically based on the Hebrew Old Testament historical books, the historical narrative. That was the model they saw for the gospel books. You remember the one that bills itself as the entirety of your word is truth in Psalm 119, 160. It was not the kind of historical narrative that mixed in with fictions and such things.
Okay, well, the early church fathers didn't like the bioi for good reason, but they're still not the ones who wrote the gospel book. So is that alone an argument to use against people like Lacona?
It wasn't simply that they didn't like them. They were rejecting the idea that the gospel books were written on that model. So it wasn't just they didn't like them. They said the gospel books are not like these Greek writings. And I think that they're in a much better position to know that than scholars, modern scholars like Lacona, who are living 19 centuries later in a very different world with very different literary theories and very different languages that they use. Why should we not take the testimony, the view of Clement or Eusebius over the view of Lacona?
Yeah.
Now, let's see how this ties in with what we've already seen about undermining the resurrection. This is the problem, the key problem. The reason this is an issue is that this approach to the gospel books undermines the truth of the resurrection, and Christianity, its truth, rests fundamentally on the truth of the resurrection of Jesus, which he himself said, that this is the proof that he gave that he would come back from the dead. Now, I mentioned previously that Lacona had earlier published a book with something in it that seems to me to have served as a trial balloon. This book was published in 2010. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. And it's widely praised as the new standard work on the subject, perhaps replacing N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. I think it's actually quite a bit overrated. But aside from that, in this book, he includes this claim. You remember in Matthew 27, there's the account of Jesus appearing before Pontius Pilate. He's being taken before the crowds, and Pilate offers to release him. The crowds are demanding, no, crucify him, release Barabbas instead. And Pilate gives in. He's afraid of starting a riot here, so he gives in. And Jesus is delivered to be crucified, and he's on the cross, and he dies. And right after he dies, we read that this happens, starting in Matthew 27:51.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but please join us for the next part tomorrow. Same time and same place. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.